The sun was sinking low over the fields of Normandy in the summer of 1944 when a small group of German nurses, still in their white uniforms, marked with the Red Cross, found themselves surrounded by American soldiers. Dust rose in the air as their transport convoy came to a halt. In their eyes flickered both exhaustion and fear, the fear of what would follow surrender. They had been taught to expect the worst humiliation, abuse, even the stripping away of their dignity. For years, Nazi propaganda had filled their ears with stories that Americans were barbaric and merciless. Now, in the fading light, with rifles trained in their direction, those stories felt dangerously close to becoming reality. One nurse, Oberon, Liesel VBR, clutched her medical satchel, as if it could protect her from the unknown. Another, Anna Muller, whispered prayers under her breath, her lips trembling. The column moved forward in silence, boots crunching on gravel. Every step seemed to echo with the weight of their fears. They imagined being dragged into filthy pens, mocked, or worse. And yet, when they entered the holding area, something holy, unexpected unfolded. Instead of shouts or jeers, the American officer in charge spoke with a steady, calm voice. His words were not laced with contempt, but with formality. Escort the nurses to the camp. The shock was immediate. Not prisoners, not women of the enemy, but nurses. The contrast was unbearable in its strains. The guards did not leer, did not spit, did not shove. They simply signaled the women forward, treating them not as spoils of war, but as human beings in uniform for the first time since capture. A flicker of confusion crossed the faces of the nurses. Could this really be the enemy they had been told was savage? A soldier moved closer, gesturing for them to sit while trucks were organized. His manner was restrained, almost courteous. Some of the women exchanged quick glances. Disbelief mingled with relief. In that fragile moment, the rigid image of the barbaric American began to crumble, though none of them dared admit. It allowed what began as a terrifying march into captivity instead opened with a paradox. The captives showed respect when contempt was expected. That paradox would deepen in the days ahead, reshaping not only how these women saw their enemies, but how they began to see themselves. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it right now as you hear the story. When dawn broke over the American P camp in France, the German nurses braced themselves for degradation. Yet the opposite occurred. From the moment they stepped off the trucks, the guards addressed them with composure and a sense of restraint. Not once did they hear the word enemy in their direction. Instead, an American lieutenant pointed toward the barracks and said, with the firmness of military protocol, but without hostility, nurses, to quarters. That single word, nurses, struck them like an unexpected blow of kindness. It suggested recognition of their profession, of their skill, rather than reducing them to a number or a faceless prisoner. Anna Muller, still shaken, later wrote in a diary, "I expected to be nothing more than a captive, but when he said nurse, I remembered I was still a human being." For women who had been taught that capture meant dishonor, this acknowledgement opened a narrow crack in their fears. The differences multiplied. As hours passed, guards stood with rifles, but their eyes were steady, not mocking. When rations were handed out, they were accompanied by words like, please and thank you. The women looked at each other in disbelief, whispering in their native tongue that such courtesies would never have been extended by some of their own German officers. The irony weighed heavily on. There was even gossip among the soldiers, some guards marveling quietly that they were ordered to treat the captured nurses with the same formal respect given to Allied medical personnel. It was not sentimentality, but discipline. The Geneva Convention, signed years earlier, was no abstract paper here. It shaped behavior down to the smallest details. No rough handling, no public humiliation. The Americans seemed determined to show that war did not strip away codes of honor. One nurse, Hildegard Kraus, remembered how, during the chaotic retreat in France, even German commanders had barked orders at her like she was disposable. To now be called nurse by the enemy left her stunned. Was it possible, she wondered, that the Americans valued their work more than their own officers had? As night fell, the women lay on straw, mattresses in the wooden barrack, still restless, still anxious. Yet beneath their fey pulse a new kind of bewilderment. Their captives had treated them not as nameless prisoners, but as professionals. The question lingered in their minds, too heavy to sleep away had the world they believed in already begun to crack. By the third day in the camp, what astonished the nurses most was not grand gestures, but the smallest details. At breakfast, they were handed trays with bread, eggs, and a steaming cup of coffee. The meal was plain, but the way it was given left them unsettled. The guard at the mess line, barely older than some of the nurses, placed each item with a simple please and ended with thank you when they moved on. It was routine for him, but for the German women, it was extraordinary. They had been trained to expect derision, to be reminded of a defeat at every turn. Instead, the Americans seemed to treat them as if courtesy was non-negotiable, even in war. Oberheller and Liesel VBR wrote in her confiscated notebook later, recovered in archives, how can it be that the enemy uses such words in our hospitals? Even superior officers never said thank you to us. Here I hear it daily. That quiet shock echoed among her companions. Respect, not mockery, defined the rhythm of their captivity. Even the practical allowances spoke volumes. They were permitted to keep certain medical tools, stethoscopes, bandages, and small kits of antiseptic. The guards explained bluntly, if fellow prisoners fell ill or wounded, the nurses should be able to help. It was a gesture that bridged necessity with dignity in their homeland. Officers had often seized equipment for their own use. Here, the captives insisted they keep it. Another small but searing moment occurred when a nurse dropped her spoon in the date. She expected to be ignored. Instead, a guard wordlessly handed her another clean one. Without smirk or reprimand, it was trivial, almost invisible. Yet to the women watching, it carried the weight of an unspoken message. You are still seen as people. There were murmurs among the prisoners that such treatment was not weakness, but discipline drilled into the Americans. Rumors spread that even enlisted U.S. Guard could face punishment for abusing captives for the German nurses raised in a system where power meant domination. This was a revelation. At night, as the barrack lanterns dimmed, the nurses whispered in disbelief, "They say please to us." One murmured, almost laughing at the absurdity, as if we were guests, not captives. The room felt quiet, the silence heavier than words. Each woman carried the same unvoiced question: if the enemy treated them with such small courtesies, what did that mean about the truths they had been taught? The days lengthened, and with them came an unexpected storm inside the minds of the German nurses, raised in a nation where propaganda thundered daily about the decadence and savagery of Americans. They now found themselves staring at a reality that shattered those lessons. The barbed wire fences and armed guards were undeniable symbols of captivity. Yet behind them was a culture of order and restraint, not the cruelty they had. Brace for, one afternoon, as the women walked in single file to the infirmary building, they passed by a group of American guards sharing a cigarette. A radio crackled in the background, carrying faint notes of jazz. The rhythm, lively, playful, utterly foreign, drifted through the camp. The nurses, accustomed to the rigid martial anthems of the Rye, exchanged startled glances. Music here was not about marching or discipline. It was about life. For the first time, Anna Mueller allowed herself to smile, then quickly suppressed it, afraid her companions might think she was betraying her homeland. The shock grew deeper in the evenings when camp routines played out. With unexpected normally, guards maintained strict schedules. Roll calls were precise but never brutal. There were no shouted insults, no random beatings. Instead, the discipline of the Americans revealed itself in silence and structure. To the women, it was disorienting. The enemy, who was supposed to be barbaric, acted with more civility than many German officers they had served under. Hildegard Kraus remembered a winter at a field hospital in Poland when a wounded German soldier had been slapped by his own sergeant for crying out in pain. Here she watched an American guard bend down to hand a fellow prisoner a canteen of water. Without hesitation, the memory seared her conscience. Could it be that everything she had believed was inverted? At night, the conversations turned into arguments whispered beneath the creaking wooden roof. Some women insisted this must be a trick, a performance stage for propaganda. Others, their voices breaking, confessed they no longer knew what to believe. One nurse muttered that she feared what would happen if she admitted to her family back home that Americans had shown them more respect than the Rye itself. The clash between expectation and reality left them restless, unable to reconcile two worlds. The propaganda, posters of snarling degenerate enemies, clashed violently with the simple image of an American soldier holding a door open for them. That image lingered more powerfully than any speech. And in the silence of the barrack, with only the distant hum of the guard radio fading into the night, the nurses felt their inner world collapsing within the camp. The days took on a rhythm that slowly softened the sharp edges of fear. It was not comfort. They were still prisoners, behind wire and under watch. But it was not the humiliation they had expected. Instead, small stories began to circulate among the women, fragments of humanity that clung to memory. One evening, a young nurse named Ilsa cut her hand while repairing a torn uniform. She hid the injury at first, ashamed to appear weak. A guard noticed blood on her cuff and called quietly for a medic. Moments later, she was astonished when an American soldier handed her a small bottle of painkillers, placing it in her palm without a word. She remembered, thinking, they do not have to do this for me. That single gesture became gossip whispered for days in the barracks, proof that even in war there were acts of silent decency. Another time permission was given for the women to sing in the evenings. It began hesitantly an old folk song from Bavaria, hummed by one voice, then joined by others until the entire barrack resonated with sound. Outside, the guards stood listening. Some leaned casually against the posts, their faces unreadable, but none stopped the music. One even murmured to another, "Let them sing. It keeps them sane inside." The nurses closed their eyes and let the familiar melodies carry them homeward, if only for a moment. These small permissions, these sparks of recognition, changed the atmosphere inside the wire. A nurse named VBR wrote in her diary, "I thought captivity would erase us. Instead, I feel I am rediscovering my own worth." Her words smuggled through notes would later surface in archives offering a glimpse into the secret hearts of these women. Yet, the paradox was painful. How could they admit, even to themselves, that they were being treated with more dignity here than in many German hospitals they had served in? Should they feel gratitude toward the enemy, or should they cling to anger, lest they betray their homeland? These questions stirred tension among them, sometimes erupting into hushed quarrels after lights out. And this brings us to you watching now. If you were in their place, confronted with kindness from those you were told to hate, would you trust it? Or would you fear it was only an illusion? Share your thoughts in the comments. As weeks turned into months, the respect shown by American guards did not fade into routine. It deepened into something harder to ignore. The nurses, once braced for constant humiliation, found themselves in a daily paradox. They remained prisoners, yet they were recognized in subtle but undeniable ways, as professionals, as women, and as individuals. The gossip in the barracks grew more personal. One story told of a guard who, noticing a nurse sketching in the margin of a confiscated notebook, quietly left a stub of pencil on her bunk the next day. Another whispered tale described how a captain allowed them to set aside a small corner of the barrack as a sick bay, trusting them to tend to minor illnesses among fellow captives. These were not grand freedoms, but fragments of autonomy that restored dignity piece by piece. Anna Mueller, in a letter never sent, wrote, "Every day I wait for the cruelty we were promised. It does not come. Instead, I am reminded of who I once wanted to be before the war swallowed us." Her words echo the struggle shared by many of the nurses caught between loyalty to the rice image of the enemy and the undeniable reality before their eyes. The guards, too, seemed aware of the contradictions, some way blunt, enforcing rules with little patience. Yet, even then, there was a boundary never crossed. One sergeant, overheard by prisoners, remarked to his men, "They wear uniform, same as us. Treat them like it." Such statements carried through the camp, seeding new layers of doubt in the nurses' minds. And the cultural shocks kept arriving. They saw guards reading newspapers aloud, debating politics freely, something unimaginable under the gaze of German censors. They noticed African-American soldiers standing among white comrades, not as equals in every way, but visible in a way that cracked the myth of American decadence painted by Nazi propaganda. Each scene chipped away at the wall of belief the Rye had built. Late at night, the women whispered questions too dangerous to voice aloud in daylight. Could the enemy be more disciplined than their own leaders? Could democracy, dismissed as weak, be stronger than the Rye? And perhaps the most unsettling of all, if their enemies respected them as nurses, had their own nation failed to do the same? I'll ask you directly, as they asked themselves then. If war taught you one truth and captivity revealed another, which would you believe? Would you cling to loyalty or to what your own eyes could see? Leave your answer in the comments. Your perspective matters here. By the spring of 1945, the war was nearing its end, and rumors of Germany's collapse spread even within the fences of the P camp. The nurses gathered in clusters, their faces pale, not only from captivity, but from the growing knowledge that the Rye they had served was crumbling. The Americans did not gloat. Instead, camp life continued with the same quiet discipline. Orders were given firmly, rations distributed methodically, but never with cruelty. It was as if the gods had chosen to let history itself deliver the punishment, not their hands. When word of Germany's surrender finally arrived, the barracks fell into stunned silence. Some of the women wept, others sat motionless, staring at the wooden floorboards. For Years they had been told the ride was eternal. Now, in the stillness of captivity, they faced the reality of defeat. Yet, alongside despair came something unexpected: relief. Relief that the killing might finally end. That perhaps their families at home could breathe again. The Americans began the process of release. Trucks were prepared, documents checked, orders issued. The nurses packed their few belongings, stethoscopes carefully wrapped in cloth, worn notebooks, a scarf carried from home. For some, the thought of return carried dread. What would their compatriots think if they spoke of being treated with respect by the enemy? Oberhellerin Leisel VBER later wrote in her memoir, "I entered captivity believing I would lose my dignity. I left it having discovered it." Her words were echoed by others in private letters that surfaced years later. They admitted that the American guards had forced them to confront a dangerous thought: that the Rye had lied and that humanity could exist even in the hands of the enemy. The departure from camp was quiet. As the women climbed into trucks, one guard raised his hand in a gesture that was neither triumphant nor mocking, but simply a farewell. The nurses exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken questions. Could they ever tell the truth of what they had seen? Would anyone believe them if they said the enemy had treated them as nurses, not prisoners? As the trucks rolled away, the barbed wire shrinking in the distance, the women carried with them not just a burden of defeat, but the memory of respect when none had been expected. That memory would outlast the war, lodged deep within them as both comfort and torment. Years later, long after the war's echoes had faded into history books and memorial stones, some of the German nurses put pen to paper. Their words did not dwell on battles or uniforms, but on small, persistent memories. The sound of a guard saying, "Please," the warmth of coffee handed across a table, the chance to sing old songs in the twilight of captivity. These fragments lingered far more vividly than any speech of ideology or command of generals. One nurse recalled that even decades later, she still dreamed of the camp at night, not of the wire, but of the music from an American radio drifting across the yard. Another remembered the quiet gesture of being handed a clean spoon after hers had fallen. These were ordinary acts, but in the chaos of war, they became extraordinary, symbols of a humanity she had once believed impossible. The paradox remained. They had been prisoners, and yet, in captivity, they had discovered a measure of respect their own nation had often denied them. That realization was not easy to carry. It clashed with loyalty, with shame, with the heavy silence demanded in post-war Germany. Still, for those who dared to admit it, the truth became a seed proof that kindness could survive, even in the harshest soil. And perhaps that is why their memories still matter. They remind us that history is not only written in treaties and battles, but in the smallest gestures between individuals. A word, a cup of coffee, a song aloud at night. These too can alter lives and linger across generations. So as we close the story, let us hold on to that lingering image. A nurse in captivity clutching her satchel, stunned not by cruelty but by respect. That image carries a quiet weight of history, and it asks us to consider in times of division, what kind of world do we choose to build with our gestures, our words, our humanity? Okay,